I've always been drawn to solitude. The city, with its unrelenting noise and chaos, had a way of gnawing at my nerves until I felt like I couldn't breathe. The deep woods were my antidote, a sanctuary where the world's weight fell away, placed by the calming embrace of nature. When I heard about Blackwood Hollow, I thought I'd found my next escape. The forest was legendary among hikers, said to be untouched and sprawling for miles without a single road or power line. It sounded perfect, except for the warnings. The locals had plenty of tales about the forest, none of them inviting. I stopped at a roadside diner before heading out, looking for a good spot to park near the trailhead. The waitress, a wiry woman with a weathered face, froze when I mentioned Blackwood Hollow. "You don't want to go there?" she said, her voice low. I raised an eyebrow. "Why not? I thought it was supposed to be beautiful." She leaned in closer, her eyes darting to the other patrons, as if someone might overhear. "It's cursed. People who go in, they don't always come out. And the ones who do..." She hesitated, lowering her voice further. "They're not right afterward." The man at the counter, who looked like he'd been there since the place opened, muttered without turning around. "Stay on the path. Don't wander." I nodded politely, thanked them for their advice, and left. Stories of curses and disappearances were common in small towns like this, designed to keep outsiders from meddling. But I wasn't deterred. I reached the forest by mid-afternoon. The trailhead wasn't marked on any official map, but a few online forums had mentioned its location. After some searching, I found it. A narrow dirt path disappearing into the trees. The woods were as stunning as I'd imagined. Towering pines stretched skyward, their branches interlocking like a cathedral's ceiling. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of earth and moss. The trail beneath my boots was soft, muffled by a carpet of fallen needles. As I walked, a profound stillness settled over the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife, birdsong, the rustling of small animals, were absent. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. The first sign of something strange came about an hour in. The path, which had been relatively clear, began to narrow. The trees on either side seemed to grow closer together, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I stopped to consult my map, only to realize the landmarks didn't match. The trail I was on wasn't marked, and I hadn't seen a single trail sign since entering the forest. Still, I pressed on, convinced it would loop back eventually. As the sun began to dip behind the treetops, the atmosphere shifted. The light dimmed, casting long shadows across the path. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper, carried on the breeze. "Turn back." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and out of place in the vast forest. No reply. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost imperceptible. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent. Shaking off my unease, I continued walking. The trail was becoming harder to follow, overgrown with roots and brambles. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow darting between the trees. By the time I reached a clearing, it was nearly dark. The open space should have felt like a relief, but instead, it sent a chill down my spine. At its center stood an ancient oak, its massive trunk scarred with strange carvings. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like humanoid figures with elongated limbs. I approached cautiously, my flashlight casting long beams across the clearing. Then I noticed the ground. Around the base of the tree were dozens of objects, old lanterns, rusted tools, and what looked like personal belongings. A shattered pocket watch, a pair of shoes, a child's toy, its paint peeling with age. The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions now. "Leave! Go back!" I spun around, flashlight sweeping through the trees. But there was no one there. The forest felt alive, watching. The branches swayed without wind. The shadows deepened unnaturally. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and when I looked up, I saw them. Figures stood among the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first I thought they were shadows, but they moved, slowly, deliberately. Their bodies were impossibly tall and thin, their faces pale and featureless, except for deep black voids where their eyes should have been. One of them stepped forward. "Stay," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. I scrambled to my feet and bolted. The trail seemed to twist beneath me, leading in directions I didn't recognize. My flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker with each step. The figures followed, gliding soundlessly between the trees, always just out of reach. I don't know how long I ran, but my legs burned, and my lungs felt ready to burst. The whispers became a roar, overlapping voices filling the forest with an unbearable cacophony. Finally, I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. Summoning the last of my strength, I sprinted toward it and broke through the tree line into the open air. I collapsed onto the roadside, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the forest was dark and still, as if nothing had happened. My backpack was gone, my map shredded, and my phone had stopped working. I made it back to my car and drove straight home, not stopping until I was miles away from Cedar Hollow. Even now, weeks later, the memories haunt me. At night, I hear whispers outside my window, faint but familiar. The symbols I saw carved into the tree appear in my dreams, their meanings just out of reach. And sometimes when I look into the woods, I swear I see them, watching, waiting. I've always prided myself on being the kind of person who doesn't scare easily. Growing up in a family of avid campers and hikers, I'd learned early on how to navigate the wilderness and trust my instincts. So when I heard about the Shrouded Valley, a remote stretch of forest in the middle of nowhere, with no marked trails and a reputation for being unwelcoming, it seemed like the perfect challenge. The valley wasn't on any official maps, but local forums and hiking blogs mentioned it in passing, usually with ominous warnings. Don't go alone. The woods aren't normal. One commenter had cryptically written, "It changes you." I dismissed it all as folklore. People love to tell tall tales about the unknown. So, one crisp October morning, I packed my gear, mapped out the vague location based on coordinates I'd found online, and drove out to the nearest road that led to the forest's edge. When I arrived, the woods seemed no different from any other I'd hiked through. Dense trees, a thick underbrush, and an earthy smell of moss and decay. The only unusual thing was the fog. A low, clinging mist hung over the ground, swirling around my boots as I walked. The first few hours of my hike were uneventful. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant caw of a crow to break the silence. The path I'd been following, faint and overgrown, gradually faded until I was bushwhacking through the underbrush, relying on my compass to keep me moving west. By mid-afternoon, I reached the crest of a ridge. Below me lay the Shrouded Valley. The name made sense now. The valley was blanketed in a dense fog that seemed almost alive, curling and shifting in unnatural patterns. The trees below were darker, their branches gnarled and twisted like arthritic fingers. Despite the unease prickling at the back of my neck, I pressed on. As I descended into the valley, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air was damp and cold, and the silence was so profound it felt oppressive. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, the crunch of leaves and twigs echoing in the stillness. That's when I noticed the first sign of something wrong. A tree, its bark stripped away in long, jagged claw marks, stood at the edge of my path. The gouges were deep, too high up to be the work of any ordinary animal. I ran my fingers over the grooves, my stomach twisting. I kept moving, but the unease only grew. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. Trees leaned at impossible angles, their branches intertwined to form a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the daylight. The fog seemed to thicken around me, dampening sound and sight. Then I started finding the carvings. At first, it was just one, a spiraling symbol etched into the trunk of a tree. But soon, I saw them everywhere, carved into bark, scratched into rocks, even arranged in patterns on the ground using sticks and bones. They weren't random. They felt deliberate, meaningful in a way I couldn't understand. By the time I set up camp, the light was fading fast. I built a small fire, but its warmth and light felt feeble against the oppressive darkness surrounding me. As I ate, I had the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, the beam cutting through the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, something pale darting between the trunks. But when I focused, there was nothing there. The first night was a nightmare. I woke to the sound of whispers, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the voices were distinct, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I sat up, heart pounding, and shone my flashlight around the tent. Shadows flickered at the edges of the beam, shapes that seemed to vanish the moment I tried to focus on them. And then, from just outside the tent, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, and too deep to be human. I held my breath, clutching the knife I kept by my side, but the sound eventually faded. The next morning, I considered turning back, but my compass was useless. The needles spun wildly, refusing to settle. I tried using the sun to navigate, but the dense fog and overcast sky made it impossible to orient myself. I was lost. As I moved deeper into the valley, the forest seemed to warp around me. Trees shifted positions when I wasn't looking. Paths that should have been there disappeared, and the carvings grew more elaborate. I began to notice other things too. Bones, small animals at first, then larger ones, scattered across the forest floor. Once, I stumbled across what looked like an abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, its contents scattered and covered in moss, as if it had been there for years. But the worst was the cabin. I found it on the third day, nestled in a clearing that felt wrong, as if the earth itself wanted to push it away. The structure was old, its wooden walls warped and rotting, the roof caved in on one side. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was colder, the smell of mildew and decay overpowering. The interior was sparse, a broken table, a rusted stove, and a single chair that looked as though it had been recently used. On the floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were bones. Human bones. I backed out of the cabin, heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw them. Figures stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the mist. They were tall, unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs and faces obscured by shadow. Their eyes, if they had any, were pits of darkness that seemed to drink in the light. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Leave," it said, though its mouth didn't move. The voice wasn't a whisper. It was a command, low and resonant, vibrating through my chest. I ran. The forest became a labyrinth, paths leading nowhere, the fog thickening until I could barely see a foot in front of me. The figures followed, their presence pressing against my mind, filling my head with fragments of thoughts that weren't my own. When I finally stumbled out of the valley, the sun was rising. The air was clear, the forest around me normal again. I made it back to my car and drove without stopping, not caring about the scratches and dents from the rough trail. That night, I dreamed of the symbols, their meaning just out of reach. And when I woke, my body ached, as if I'd been running all night. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the valley marked me, that the forest isn't done with me, Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to whispers outside my window, faint and beckoning. And in the corner of my eye, I see the figures waiting in the shadows, waiting for me to return.